The date is the 6th of March 1952, a cold Warsaw morning. In Mokotów prison, a man is led from his cell into a courtyard. He is 57 years old. His hair has gone grey. His face is lined but composed, the face of a man who has decided, somewhere along the way, that composure is the last dignity available to him. His name is Jürgen Stroop, and in a few minutes he will hang by his neck until he is dead, in the same city he spent 3 weeks systematically destroying, in the same country where he burned tens of thousands of human beings alive in underground bunkers, in the same place where he personally raised a pistol and shot children who were trying to escape the flames. The photographs taken that morning show a man who does not flinch, who does not weep, who does not ask for forgiveness or offer a final statement of remorse. He walks to the gallows with the same flat, deliberate composure that characterized everything he did. The trap opens. The rope goes taut. This is Jürgen Stroop's story, and I warn you now, it is going to be hard to stomach. If you're new here, consider subscribing. The people who died in the Warsaw Ghetto deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told completely and without flinching. On the 26th of September 1895, in the small Westphalian town of Detmold, Germany, a boy takes his first breath. His name, at birth, is Joseph Stroop. He will later change it to Jürgen, a small self-reinvention, an early signal of a man who understood the power of crafting an identity. His father is a police officer. The household is orderly, conservative, rooted in the rhythms of small-town German life. He attends school. He grows up. He is, by every available account, an unremarkable boy in an unremarkable town. Nothing suggested he would become the man who wrote in his own hand in an official report submitted proudly to his superiors, the phrase that history has never forgotten. The Jewish Quarter of Warsaw no longer exists. He was not born into hatred. He was not raised in a household of particular virulence or extremism. He was a product of the same provincial German middle class that produced millions of people who lived their lives without becoming war criminals. But history intervened, as it always does, and Jürgen Stroop made his choices within it. The First World War shaped him, as it shaped everyone who passed through it. He served on the Western Front, was wounded, was decorated. He came home to a Germany that had been humiliated, the Treaty of Versailles, the reparations, the territorial losses, the inflation that destroyed savings and livelihoods, and the dignity of ordinary families. Germany in the 1920s was a nation in psychological collapse, and in that collapse, movements that offered simple explanations and powerful enemies found fertile ground. Stroop joined the Nazi Party in 1932. He joined the SS shortly afterward. He was not coerced. He was not conscripted into ideology. He sought it out, embraced it, rose within it with consistent and deliberate effort. He chose, he joined, he climbed, he chose. Stroop's rise through the SS was steady and, within the logic of that organization, impressive. He was competent, obedient, and possessed of the particular combination of administrative efficiency and ideological commitment that the SS rewarded. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, he was conducting anti-partisan operations in occupied Soviet territories, campaigns of deliberate brutality against civilian populations that served as both military operations and rehearsals for mass murder. Villages burned, populations executed. The language in his reports was always precise, always clinical, always proud. Fellow officers noted something about Stroop that would become more significant in retrospect. He was not a man who issued orders and retreated to his headquarters. He was present. He wanted to see. He visited execution sites. He walked through the aftermath of operations he had commanded. He was not, in the language of the bureaucratic murderer, a man who kept comfortable administrative distance from the consequences of his orders. He wanted proximity to the thing itself. In April of 1943, Stroop received an assignment. He was sent to Warsaw. For the first time in his life, Jürgen Stroop had real power. Not the contingent supervised power of a field officer in a larger operation, but the absolute autonomous authority of a man given a specific task and the resources to accomplish it by whatever means he deemed necessary. His task was simple, as his superiors framed it. The Warsaw Ghetto needed to be cleared. The Jews remaining there needed to be removed, transported or killed. The operation was expected to take 3 days. What he found in Warsaw was something he had not anticipated. The Warsaw Ghetto had been established by the German occupiers in 1940, a walled enclosure in the heart of the city into which over 400,000 Jewish people had been compressed. By April of 1943, through starvation, disease, and systematic deportations to Treblinka, that number had been reduced to somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000. The people who remained knew what the deportations meant. They had heard from the few who escaped Treblinka. They understood that the cattle cars did not lead to labor camps in the east. They understood what was coming, and so they had made a decision that stands, even now, as one of the most extraordinary acts of collective human courage in recorded history. They would fight. The Jewish Combat Organization, the JOB, and other resistance groups had spent months preparing. They had acquired weapons through extraordinary effort, smuggled pistols, homemade grenades, a handful of rifles. They had built bunkers, tunnels, concealed positions. They had organized. Young men and women, most of them in their 20s, many of them teenagers, who had already lost parents and siblings and entire communities to the Nazi machinery, decided that they would not go to Treblinka without making the Germans pay for every step. On the 19th of April 1943, the eve of Passover, Stroop led his forces into the ghetto. He had SS troops, Wehrmacht soldiers, Ukrainian auxiliaries, and armoured vehicles. He expected 3 days. What he got was 28 days of combat from people armed with pistols and bottles of gasoline. The fighters of the JOB inflicted casualties that humiliated the SS. They repelled Stroop's initial advances. They forced his troops back from multiple positions. They fought from rooftops and from underground bunkers and from burning buildings, and they kept fighting when they had almost nothing left to fight with. Mordecai Anielewicz, the 23-year-old commander of the JOB, coordinated the resistance from a bunker at 18 Miła Street. Young people who had every reason, by any rational calculation, to despair chose instead to resist. Stroop's response to being held up by a resistance he had been told would not exist was methodical and total. He could not easily defeat the fighters in direct combat. And so he decided to remove the environment in which they were fighting. Building by building, block by block, he burned the Warsaw Ghetto to the ground. He burned it. He deployed flamethrowers. He sent in teams to set fires systematically, working from building to building in a deliberate pattern designed to drive people out of concealment and into the open. The fires spread through the ghetto with a speed that even Stroop's own reports acknowledged as remarkable. The wooden structures burned fast, the stone buildings burned slower, and in the buildings that burned slower, in the basements and the bunkers where thousands of civilians, not fighters but old people, women, children, had taken shelter, people burned. 56,000 people. 56,000. And that number, from Stroop's own report, represents only those accounted for in his documentation. Those killed directly, those captured and transported, those confirmed dead. The actual toll is likely higher. These weren't statistics. These were individual human beings. A grandmother who had survived the ghetto's starvation years holding herself together for the sake of grandchildren who needed her. A father who had told his children they would get through this. Children who did not understand what was happening but who were afraid, who were hungry, who were in the dark of a basement while the building above them burned. Stroop walked among the ruins as the ghetto burned. He was observed moving through the operations with the same deliberate presence that colleagues had noted in earlier postings. He did not manage the destruction from a distance. He was there, And he was doing something else. He was documenting. Here is what makes Jürgen Stroop different from many other perpetrators of comparable crimes. He was proud, not privately proud, in the way of a man who keeps his satisfaction hidden behind a professional facade, but openly, bureaucratically, institutionally proud. He wanted a record. He wanted credit. He wanted posterity to know what he had accomplished. He compiled what would later become known simply as the Stroop Report, a bound volume, multiple copies of which were produced, which included his official dispatches to SS headquarters in Berlin, daily reports of the operation's progress, meticulous in their detail, proud in their tone, along with a collection of photographs. The photographs. There are images in the Stroop Report that have become among the most widely reproduced documentary photographs of the Holocaust. In particular, there is one photograph that has come to define the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in the visual memory of the world. A small boy, perhaps 8 or 10 years old, his hands raised above his head, surrounded by German soldiers with rifles. He is wearing a cap. He is wearing a coat. He is looking at the camera with an expression that has been described across decades of analysis as simultaneously terrified and somehow composed, the composure of a child who has arrived at the edge of everything they know and is still standing. Stroop included this photograph in his report. He included it because it illustrated, from his perspective, the success of the operation. The capture of this child, of these people, of this resistance, was something he wanted his superiors to see. He was not ashamed of the photograph. He was proud of it. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate documentation of deliberate crime by a man who did not believe, in April of 1943, that he would ever be called to account for any of it. The testimony gathered after the war from the small number of ghetto fighters and residents who survived described scenes that Stroop's own clinical reports only partially captured. People who fled burning buildings and emerged into streets where German soldiers were waiting. People who jumped from windows to escape fire and were shot before they hit the ground. People who attempted to move through the ghetto's sewer system, the extraordinary network that resistance members used to move between positions, and were discovered and killed underground, or forced back to the surface and killed there. Stroop personally shot people trying to escape. This is not an inference from the pattern of events. It is documented in testimony. He was present, he was armed, and he used his weapon on people who were running from fires that he had ordered set. He shot children trying to escape the flames. What kind of person does this? Let the question sit there, because the answer is not a simple one. Stroop was not, in any clinical sense, mentally ill. He was not operating in a psychotic break from reality. He was a competent, organized, administratively capable man who had risen through a bureaucratic organization on the strength of his professional performance. He understood what he was doing. He understood that the people in the ghetto were human beings. The resistance they put up made that impossible to deny. You cannot simultaneously dismiss a population as subhuman and explain why it took your forces 4 weeks to defeat their pistols with your tanks and flamethrowers. He understood, and he continued, and he documented it with pride. Even hardened SS officers found this disturbing. That phrase applies with particular weight to what Stroop did in Warsaw, because the scale and the visibility of the destruction, an entire urban district burned to the ground, the smoke visible across the city, the sounds audible to Warsaw's non-Jewish population on the other side of the walls, exceeded even what the SS's own procedures had anticipated. There were officers in Berlin and in Warsaw who worried about the operational and propaganda implications of what Stroop was doing, not because they objected morally, because they worried about witnesses, about exposure, about the sheer visibility of this particular atrocity. Stroop didn't worry. He sent his daily reports. He compiled his photographs. He waited for commendation. On the 16th of May 1943, Stroop sent his final report on the operation. He personally detonated the explosives that destroyed the Great Synagogue of Warsaw. A building that had stood outside the ghetto walls, not a military target, not a strategic objective, simply a symbol he wanted destroyed. The blast was, by his own account, beautiful. He signed his report. He included his photographs. And he wrote the line that has followed him across history: "The Jewish Quarter of Warsaw no longer exists." Germany's war continued for 2 more years after Warsaw. Stroop received his commendations. He was transferred to Greece, where he conducted operations against partisan resistance with the same methods he had refined in Warsaw. He was transferred back to Germany as the Allied noose tightened. By 1945, the war that had given men like Stroop their extraordinary and criminal authority was ending. The Reich was collapsing, and suddenly the detailed records that Stroop had so proudly maintained became a different kind of document entirely. He was captured by American forces in May of 1945. He was tried by an American military tribunal in Dachau in 1947. The evidence against him was overwhelming, much of it in his own handwriting, with his own signature, compiled by his own hand into a bound volume he had produced in multiple copies as a gift for senior SS leadership. He was convicted. He was sentenced to death. But the execution was not carried out immediately. Poland requested his extradition. Poland specifically wanted to try the man who had destroyed Warsaw, who had burned the ghetto, who had shot people in the streets of a Polish city, while its other inhabitants could hear the fires from across the wall. The extradition was granted. And in 1951, Jürgen Stroop stood trial again in Warsaw for crimes against the Polish nation and the Jewish people of Warsaw. The trial was conducted in the city he had destroyed. Survivors testified. The people who took the stand against him had, in some cases, been children during the uprising. They were adults now, carrying everything that the intervening years had required them to carry, and they stood in a Warsaw courtroom, and they described what they had seen, what they had survived, what had been done to the people who did not survive. The Stroop report was entered into evidence. His own photographs were shown to the court. His own words were read aloud. His own daily progress reports, with their careful accounting of bunkers destroyed and people killed and buildings burned, were placed before judges and read into the record. Stroop's defense was, in its essence, the same defense that Nazi defendants always offered. He was a soldier. He had received orders. He had carried out those orders within the framework of military and organizational structures that demanded compliance. He was a functionary of a system, not the author of its crimes. But the court had his photographs. The court had his words. The court had a bound volume that he had personally compiled and personally signed and personally submitted to his superiors as evidence of his achievement. It was very difficult, in the face of that documentation, to argue that Jürgen Stroop was merely following orders. The orders he had followed with enthusiasm, with creativity, with personal participation, and with the evident desire to leave a permanent record of what he had done. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death by hanging. The 6th of March, 1952. Mokotów Prison, Warsaw. We return to where we began. Stroop is led out in the early morning. The courtyard is cold. There are witnesses, court officials, prison personnel, people whose job it is to verify that the sentence is carried out. There are photographs taken. The photographs that have survived show a man who is present, who is upright, who does not appear to be in visible distress. He walks to the gallows with deliberateness. He is placed. The hood, if one is used, accounts vary on this detail. The rope. He had walked through the burning Warsaw Ghetto with the same deliberateness. He had moved through the ruins of buildings where people were dying with the same composure. He had signed his reports with the same steady hand. And now, at the end of everything, he maintained the same flat, unreadable affect that had characterized everything he did. The trap opened. The rope went taut. Was this justice? The question is not a simple one. Justice, in the formal sense, was served. A court tried him, found him guilty, and imposed the sentence that the law prescribed. He died for what he did, which is more than can be said for many who committed comparable crimes. He did not live to old age in comfort. He did not tend a garden in a country that didn't know his name. But consider the arithmetic. Jürgen Stroop was 57 years old when he died. The children who burned in the bunkers of the Warsaw Ghetto did not reach 57. The boy in the photograph, hands raised, cap on his head, looking at the camera, did not reach 57. Mordecai Anielewicz, 23 years old when he died in his bunker on Miła Street on the 8th of May 1943, did not reach 57. The fighters of the Jobbik, most of them teenagers and young adults, who chose to resist when resistance was almost certainly futile because they decided that dying on their own terms was preferable to being loaded onto cattle cars. They did not reach 57. Stroop lived 9 years after the war. He was tried twice. He had 9 years more than the people he burned. And here is the final detail that history must record. The photographs from his execution show a man who is not weeping, not asking for forgiveness, not offering in his final moments any acknowledgement of the specific human beings whose deaths he had documented with such careful pride. There is no record of a final statement of remorse, no record of names spoken, no acknowledgement that the people he burned in those bunkers were people. He went to the gallows the same way he walked through the ghetto, with composure, with the flat certainty of a man who, even at the end, did not appear to have arrived at a reckoning with what he had done. The Warsaw Ghetto no longer existed because he destroyed it. He said so himself in his own words, with his own signature, and he was proud of it until the rope ended his pride. The boy in the photograph deserved to grow old. Every person in that ghetto deserved to grow old. They deserved the ordinary, unremarkable continuity of a life allowed to reach its natural end. The grey hair, the lined face, the cold morning that is just a cold morning and nothing more. Stroop's report is held today at the United States National Archives and at the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland. The photographs are preserved. The daily dispatches are preserved. His own words are preserved. And the photograph of the boy with his hands raised is preserved, studied, reproduced, placed in textbooks and museums and documentary films, used again and again to illustrate what was done in Warsaw and why it must never be forgotten. That boy's name is not definitively known. Historians have debated it for decades. He may have been Zvi Nussbaum, identified by some accounts. He may have been someone else. He may have survived, as a small number of people in that photograph's background appear to have survived. Or he may not have. The uncertainty is itself a kind of testimony to what Stroop's operation accomplished, the destruction not just of lives, but of the records and communities and contexts that would have preserved those lives in history. Jürgen Stroop knew the names of no one he killed. He never learned them. He never tried. That is his legacy. History will never forget.